Guys, we're going to start. Sorry for being a bit late, but I think we finished a bit late in the morning, and so we're going to start right now the third session, which is called Towards a Token Economy. And so we'll have three speakers in the order of passage. First, Florian GLATZ. I hope I'm saying your name right. Yeah. Who's a blockchain lawyer, who will speak of legal classification of tokens. Then we'll have Julien Prat, who's at CNRS and École Polytechnique, who will address the fundamental value of tokens. And then we'll finish with Vincent DANOS, here our wonderful host, who's with CNRS and École Normale Supérieure, who will discuss new tokenomics theories. So, Florian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you to Florence GLATZ for the invitation to be able to speak here. So I was asked to talk about classifying blockchain tokens from a legal perspective. I broadened the topic a bit. I will just talk about the token zoo, as I call it. It's taken from physics. They call it about the particle zoo, I think. So we are in a similar situation here where, goodbye Xavier, where basically every day people come up with a new way to structure a token or to invent new names for tokens. So it's really quite chaotic, and I just, before I actually start, I just want to give a quick, context to who I am. So I came here from Berlin. That's where I live, and that's where I work. And like similar to ASEF that you have here in France, we have an association in Germany. It's called the German Blockchain Association. As creative as we Germans are, we call it like that. And that's the picture we took when we incorporated like a year ago, actually. And we were successful. So our mission is to influence politics to make better regulation on blockchain. And our big success was that the new government in Germany actually gave itself an agenda to regulate blockchain constructively in the coalition agreement between the parties that now form the new government. Unfortunately, the government seems to be breaking apart currently, but if we're lucky, maybe it's gonna stay around. And so what I'm showing you here is the PDF file that is the official contract between those parties, right, that are making the government. And if you search for blockchain, you find the term 7 times, which is obscene. I mean, 1 time would have been enough, but no, 7. So it's a real thing. And what's happening, the consequence of this is now basically, every week or every other week, some ministry is doing a workshop on blockchain, and there is, they want to understand really what's happening, and they're actually interested in constructive, like progressive, innovation-friendly regulation. So that's cool. So I want to give a brief history of tokens. Tokens were one of the first applications that pushed blockchain beyond its original use case as an accounting ledger for this base currency of a network. Beyond something else. Tokens, unfortunately, are also just an accounting form of accounting, but it's not accounting for, Bitcoin on the Bitcoin blockchain, right? That's the original use of blockchain, and since tokens were invented, you could do accounting of other kinds of assets on this very same blockchain. So you could exploit the security of the Bitcoin blockchain, run your own token or currency on the Bitcoin blockchain, but you wouldn't be transferring Bitcoins, right? You just have your own made-up accounting system on it. So that's where tokens come from. That happened basically in the year 2012. Tokens were just meta information encoded into Bitcoin transaction. It's like a hack, right? So the first platform was called Colored Coins. Mastercoin actually pivoted the idea, and then Colored Coins came out of it, Counterparty, an endless number of protocols that did this. And then this really young and by now famous Russian guy called Vitalik Buterin just generalized this idea and said, let's make a protocol where creating new tokens is basically, you know, the core function of the protocol. So it's not an afterthought, it's the primary raison d'etre, so to speak, for the protocol. So that's was basically 2014, 2015 when the Ethereum protocol was invented and then subsequently launched in May 2015. And basically now it's so easy to create a token that a 5-year-old can do it. And that's the reason why we're sitting here, because that has really started to change the world, that everybody can launch their own currency without any effort whatsoever. Yeah, and if we're thinking about token classification, just some precursor. So there is no official definition, I would say, of a token. I would say a token is the digital identity of something that can be owned by some agent in a blockchain network. Tokens can have multiple dimensions. A token always has a functional dimension. That means a token is associated with a piece of code, and that piece of code defines what you can do technologically speaking with this token. But tokens can also have other dimensions, which are interesting. So they can, I call it a representational dimension. So they can have a physical representation, or rather the token is the digital representation of a physical good. That can be the same with virtual goods, computer games, and so on. And legal rights and debts and claims and so on, respectively. However, all of those tokens ultimately reduce to more or less this piece of code, which is the how do I make my own token in 5 minutes code that you get when you go to ethereum.org/token. That's the code they give you. It's a 23 lines piece of code, and it defines the minimum amount of functionality that any token out there would have. Actually, this smart contract behind me that you see has been standardized now, and it's being called just the ERC20 token contract. And what's interesting about it is that you define your assets in there, so the tokens. You define how those assets are distributed initially, like who owns how many of them, who can buy them, or who can, you know, acquire them. Trading aspects are defined in there. How to invest in this is defined in there. And more increasingly, even governance is being done on-chain inside those contracts. Yeah, so this is this representational dimension I've been talking about. So you can have a token that has nothing but functionality on a blockchain, but it can also be associated with other goods, be it a house or a car, as a physical good or a virtual goods, or legal rights like a copyright license or a bond that you see here in the background. The standardization is happening basically in an open process on the internet. This is the original thread that defined the Ethereum's, the ERC20 standard, which is behind this crazy token economy that you know, that's here. It's from 19th of November 2015. Fabian Vogelsteller, he's a German software developer working for the Ethereum Foundation at the time. He just created a forum, a thread on the internet saying, hey guys, I think we should standardize what a token smart contract looks like. Because what you get is you get infinite compatibility, interoperability between currencies and so on. A very recent one is this one here. It's the ERC721. It tries to define non-fungible tokens. So that's the idea where, maybe going back to that slide, if a token represents a house, that token is not fungible, obviously, because the house is unique, right? So you don't have fungibility, so what you want is a standard for a non-fungible token. That's also being defined currently, originally in September 2017, but the discussion is ongoing. Yeah, so that's how those standards arrive. If we're looking at token classes today from the legal perspective now, that's I think what's interesting here is we see more or less 5 different asset classes. That's really arbitrary. So that is what lawyers do when they try to make sense of something that is primarily technology driven, I would say. So we have payment and utility tokens. You will find those categories of tokens mentioned in pretty much any text written by a lawyer about this situation. We have app tokens, we have security tokens, and we have asset tokens. So more or less 5 different token classes today. The payment token supposedly is unique or is special because its only function really is to serve as a medium of payment between agents on the blockchain. The utility token, on the other hand, is used for payments, but not general purpose payments, but payments for specific kinds of digital services provided in a blockchain network. Okay, so the example mentioned here is often Ethereum or Stellar. Raiden is another one. So there are millions of them. If you go to coinmarketcap.com or something like that, you will see hundreds of, not hundreds of thousands, but thousands of those utility tokens. To me personally, it's questionable if there really is a difference between payment and utility tokens. I think this is also increasingly being recognized that it's kind of a false dichotomy, I think, between those 2 categories, but they are more or less being treated differently right now. And I've kind of made 2 rows of tokens here because, so those upper ones, the payment, utility token, Bitcoin being obviously the most famous example of a payment token, they are, you could say, decentralized, so to speak, whereas the bottom row really is a new form of asset, a new form of tokens that are not really dominant yet, but people expect them to become very important. They are not as decentralized anymore as their predecessors. App tokens are really vouchers. So an app token is just when a company issues vouchers that can be used with the services of that company, but those vouchers are expressed in form of a digital token. So there's really nothing special about it. You have security tokens, which is, I think, becoming a big thing now. So the idea is that you can tokenize existing securities like shares in a company, any other forms of securitized debt. They can all just be represented as a token on a blockchain, and what you gain is just more markets, access to more markets, access to more investors, and obviously standardization and all those things. So that is interesting. And the newest asset class, I would say, that is on the horizon is the asset token. So the idea is not to tokenize any given security, but actually to put an asset on the blockchain as much as possible. So the idea would be, gold or diamonds or other kinds of goods out there that you want represented as a token on the blockchain. Obviously, that will also require intermediaries, and it quickly becomes a security. It's an asset token is basically security today, but maybe in the future we will see legal systems change in such a way that there is a meaningful difference between an asset token and a security token. The most interesting example I could mention here is Liechtenstein. It's funny that somebody mentioned this country already today. It's a small country between Switzerland and Austria. And they have just proposed a new law that would make this potentially a reality, right? So they really, you could say they made an open heart surgery on their civil law, on property law in their civil code, right? So you change that once every 100 to 200 years, basically. And they are changing, they proposed a change which would really allow the tokenization of assets as opposed to simple securities. So, and maybe a last category to mention that is very far away on the horizon, but interesting, is the idea of stable coins. So the idea that you have a cryptocurrency that is stable relative to some other to something else, right? The question is, well, to what? So what we're seeing here is just simple, fiat collateralized coins where you have a bank, they have a checking account, and they keep always the equivalent of euros or dollars on their bank account, that they the equivalent to what they issue as tokens on the chain, on the blockchain, meaning that you have a euro token, right, or a dollar token, because there is a one-to-one backing. But what is happening slowly, more slowly, but what is the really interesting one, is the idea of a non-collateralized stablecoin. But then you got to ask, well, what is it stable relative towards? And then we're really thinking about putting a real economy, putting central banks, essentially, on the blockchain. And people are thinking about it. This whole free banking movement, obviously, has been around for way longer than blockchain, and I think they have good ideas how to potentially get there. So now I want to just quickly give you an overview of how we differentiate between security tokens and non-security tokens, so to speak, utility tokens in Europe and the US. That's a question that every entrepreneur more or less has when they want to launch an ICO or something. They wonder, well, is that a security token or not? And in Europe, we've seen a lot of countries, including France, issue statements explaining when they think there is a security and when they think there is not. The Swiss FINMA issued a guidance where they said, well, basically what all the authorities said was function over form, so you can call it whatever you want, we don't care. We really look at the economic function of this token, and if it behaves like a security under European law, we will treat it as a security no matter what. Interestingly, France actually, I think, proposed quite a constructive idea for non-security tokens, how they could basically be best handled in this kind of ICO visa approach. But since my French is so bad, I really haven't read the original source, so this is hearsay, so maybe talk to a French lawyer if you want to understand more about that. So European securities law governs all token issuances in Europe. So France, Germany, and every other country in Europe is bound by these laws. However, it's not a law that applies directly. It's a directive, so directive is being transposed into national laws by the national parliaments. So we have this directive called MiFID II, and MiFID II really tells you all you want to know about securities in Europe. So if you want to know if your token is a security, just look into this law. It's really straightforward. There are basically 4 important check marks that you got to make. So a security token is transferable, it's negotiable on a capital market, and it's standardized. So every token pretty much fulfills those 3 conditions. But the 4th one is really where you can see if you're a security or not. You need to be functionally comparable to shares and other forms of securitized debt. And there's an example catalog of which instruments fall under this regulation. I've mentioned it in the previous slide. It's Article 4, paragraph 1, number 44. There's a list of instruments that if your token functions like that instrument, you're a security. And the American regime, just everybody probably heard of it, it's the Howey test. So the Americans, as we all know, they are not that much into statutory laws. So what they have is really just a flexible test that is being applied by the American authority, the SEC, and they are asking, well, is this an investment of money happening here? Is it a common enterprise? Is there an expectation of profits? And is it reliant on the effort of others? So those questions are being applied to ICOs particularly. And the American SEC actually is of the conviction that most ICOs are somehow relating to the sale of securities, whereas the European regulator more or less recognized that there is this, field of tokens that really do not comply or do not fall under European securities law. And hard to say how Europe and the US will, get along here. Since a year and a half, there is, let's say, a semi-regular meeting between the SEC and European regulators and also non-European regulators, trying to find a consensus on what's happening here. And I would say we're quite far away from that, but at least we're making some progress. What are the projects doing really? In the meantime, they are doing jurisdictional arbitrage. Their list of priorities is blockchain-friendly financial markets regulator, political stability, low taxes, and access to banking. And number 4 is really where the music is playing, so to speak, right? So access to banking is super hard still for ICOs today. And ultimately, you end up going to the country where there is a bank giving you a bank account, right?
So what do you mean by access to banking?
So being able to make an ICO where, let's say, you collect 30 million in cryptocurrencies, and then you want to sell, let's say, 50, 60, 70% of those cryptocurrencies for fiat, like euro, and then you want to keep those euros on some bank account to spend it on salaries. And that last step, right, transferring that money to a bank account is what's so hard, because there's almost no bank that, the banks are obliged to ask, where does that money come from? What are the source of funds? And if you say, well, I did an ICO, so I collected, millions from strangers on the internet, the bank will say, well, we don't want that money, so we can't take it, right, for compliance reasons. So you really need to find a bank that is willing to work on its own internal compliance processes in such a way that they can accept ICO money if it has been collected correctly, right? So there needs to be, both parties need to talk to each other, and there is a shortage of banks doing that. So that's And now there are also approaches at self-regulation. There are projects that want to offer, incentives for people to disclose relevant information, not with the regulator forcing them to, but basically just by saying, well, you will probably have more recognition on the market, more investors or higher investments if you disclose your information according to our schemes and databases and so on. And maybe just to finish this off, what is the future of all of this, right? What is the future of law? The future of law and regulation is really law, I think, will take this concept of baseline regulation that you fall back onto once you don't know how else to proceed anymore. But if the worst case doesn't happen, basically more and more functions will be done through technology as opposed to law. The Roger Brown thought, an academic that I personally admire, he has this really nice term saying from prescription as a mechanism of governance to one of possibilities, meaning that you don't say, well, you ought to or you shouldn't, but really, well, those are your options A, B, and C, and you cannot deviate from it because it's technologically forbidden. And that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Maybe we're going to take 1 or 2 quick questions for Florian. Any questions?
You mentioned access to banking. Right now in the EU, what do you view the top 2 countries providing access to banking? Not including Switzerland, not EU.
Okay, in the EU. So,
Maybe, sorry, do you mind repeating the question?
yeah, sorry, yeah. So I was asked where in the European Union, not in the EWR, EEA, I mean, where in the European Union can you get access to banking as a crypto company that did an ICO? So there is a really, really tiny bank in a tiny village in eastern Germany. I'm not joking. This is where the guy came from that programmed the DAO. I mean, he still lives there. And, he became, or this whole project of the DAO became so famous that this whole village is now totally into blockchain. Like everybody there knows blockchain and, wants blockchain to succeed. So the bank there, which is really small, they supposedly make accounts for crypto companies in Germany. I've heard that multiple times now, so there is something to it. I just haven't talked to them yet personally, so I cannot confirm, but I've heard that. It's in Mittweida. It's Volksbank Mittweida. Or Sparkasse, I don't know. It's a very small bank. And beyond that, really, you just hear that, oh yeah, you know, Commerzbank, they are supposedly now crypto-friendly, or there's this bank supposedly now crypto-friendly. But I don't think there are many banks that would open accounts right now, unfortunately.
Other question.
Just a very quick question, Florian. What difference do you actually make between the utility and the app token? I didn't get your point there.
Yeah, I didn't expand too much on that. The app token is a voucher where there is a counterparty, which is this central issuer of this voucher system, right? Whereas in a utility token, like Ethereum, you pay transaction fees to miners, but you don't really know who those miners are. So I would say there is no counterparty. That's how I understand the difference. Yeah, I don't follow that opinion. I've heard that many times, and maybe it's actually true, and I just have this dogmatic thing in my head where I don't get it, but for me, a utility token is not a voucher. I don't see it, because utility token, I don't see the difference between a utility token and a payment token. There's no difference.
There is a difference of degree, because a currency-like token or a payment token, you can exchange it against an endless goods and services, whereas a utility token, you only can exchange it against the services and goods of this given network.
But it's not true.
So
That's wrong. And that's maybe where this mistake comes from. So a voucher is that, what you're saying. A voucher only works within this, you know, let's say an Amazon voucher. I just can only exchange it on the Amazon platform, right? Even with third-party people selling stuff, right? On the Amazon platform, I can pay with a voucher there, but only on the Amazon platform. With a utility token, I mean, it has a market. It's being traded everywhere. It has all the functionalities of Bitcoin plus some more. It is in an open loop economy, right? There's no, at least that's how I see it. But
a token that is issued by a company going for an ICO, is it a voucher?
well, that depends, right? You can sell all kinds of different tokens in an ICO. The ICO is not a limiting factor. ICO is a distribution mechanism for tokens.
And
Look at the code you had earlier
Mhm.
for the minimal token. There was the generation part, but there was no trading. Right. So in the code you showed before, talking about ERC20,
There was the generation part, but not the trading part. Okay. So to repeat your question. Oh.
so it's not a question. It's
Okay.
there's when you look at the trading, there's a transfer from one account to another. It says remove one from that account, add one to the other. It's the
It was on the screen though. I had a transfer function displayed.
There was the transfer to an address, but not from and to, if I remember properly. There's always two. There's the one that generates the coin from the general supply to an account.
It was both on there. Yeah.
So anyway, for a voucher, you literally spend it. It goes away.
Exactly right. Yeah.
It's not
That's a good point.
minus plus.
Yeah.
It's just minus.
Thank you. Yeah, I like that.
maybe one last question for Florian. Sorry, the microphone ran out of battery. If you can speak loud, or Florian repeat the question. Any last question? Yes.
How are the ways to make sure that an asset wouldn't be a security? Like now you said like most are seen as a security, but what would be cases?
For security?
Assets not being
Not. Oh, actually, most. So, okay, that is a question of opinion. So, for the Americans, everything that we've seen so far is pretty much the sale of securities. They recently said Ether is not, and Bitcoin is not, but everything else pretty much is. In Europe, we have a more differentiated view. And here, actually, we say most of the ICOs that happened so far are probably not securities. Most of the tokens that have been sold in ICOs are probably not securities. That's the correct way to say it. Because they are not close enough in their economic functioning to how a share works. So you don't have any way of, you know, any voting rights, for example, in an organization, and you have no guarantee, or you have no legal claim against somebody to pay you dividend. So since all that stuff is missing from the European perspective, they are not securities. So yeah, I think there are a lot of examples for tokens not being securities. Ether being a very famous one, even acknowledged by the SEC and so on. And what is also happening is that projects, they sell tokens which could be utility tokens, but they are advertising them in a way that they become securities, because they are making, you know, promises not in their prospectus or white paper, but in their blog posts, in their YouTube interviews, in all that stuff, where they basically, you know, advertise it, that it becomes a security, because you're promising economic returns and a chance for investment. And I don't know, you know, you can talk it up in such a way that regulators then will say, well, you know, really that is a security at this point. So it's a sliding scale, I would say.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Florian. And thank you, maybe we... Well, so the next speaker is Julien Prat. Julien.